Alright, I need to show you something that's going to completely flip your understanding of how wealthy people actually think about money. I recently spent time analyzing the homes of self-made millionaires, people worth 5, 10, even $20 million. And what I found was honestly shocking. These people are living in houses that cost less than what many middle-class families are stretching themselves to afford. And no, they're not being cheap. They figured out something that most people completely miss about building real wealth. My name is John, and on this channel, we break down the actual strategies that separate people who look rich from people who are actually building wealth. And today's topic is one of those things that seems weird at first, but once you understand it, it completely changes how you think about money. Because here's what nobody tells you. The decisions wealthy people make with their homes are completely backwards from what most people expect. So let me start with a story that perfectly illustrates this. I have a friend who sold his tech company for about $8 million after taxes. First thing most people do in that situation, buy a dream house, right? Maybe something in the $2 or $3 million range makes sense. You worked hard, you earned it, why not enjoy it? But here's what he actually did. He bought a house for $450,000 in a nice but modest neighborhood. And when people found out, they thought he was crazy. His family was confused. His friends were asking if something went wrong with the sale. But 5 years later, that decision is one of the main reasons his net worth has grown to over $15 million. Meanwhile, other people who sold companies around the same time and bought those dream houses, a lot of them are actually worth less now than they were 5 years ago. And it's not because their investments perform differently. It's because of what I call the hidden wealth drain that comes with expensive houses. Now, before we go further, I want to be really clear about something. I'm not saying you shouldn't buy a nice house. I'm not saying everyone should live in a tiny apartment forever. What I'm saying is that there's a specific point where the cost of your house starts working against your wealth building instead of for it. And most people cross that line without ever realizing it happened. So, what is this hidden wealth drain? Well, it starts with something that most people don't think about when they're buying a house. They look at the mortgage payment and think, okay, I can afford that. Maybe it's a stretch, but I can make it work. But the mortgage is actually just the beginning. There's this thing I call the lifestyle multiplication effect, and it's one of the sneakiest ways that expensive houses destroy wealth. Here's how it works. Let's say you buy a house for $800,000 instead of $400,000. Obviously, your mortgage is higher, but that's not where the real cost comes from. The real cost comes from everything else that scales with that house. Property taxes are higher, homeowners insurance is higher, but here's where it gets interesting. You're also going to furnish it differently. You're not putting IKEA furniture in an $800,000 house. You're buying nicer stuff. You're going to landscape it differently. You're probably hiring a landscaping service instead of mowing the lawn yourself. Your utility bills are higher because the house is bigger. You need more furniture, more maintenance, more repairs. And here's the really subtle part. Your social circle starts to change. You're living in a neighborhood where people have certain expectations about cars, about vacations, about schools for their kids, and you start spending more on all of those things without even consciously deciding to. I've seen this happen over and over again. Someone buys a house that's double the price of what they could comfortably afford, and within 2 years, their entire spending pattern has shifted. They're spending 30, 40, sometimes 50% more on everything. Not because they decided to, but because the house created a new lifestyle baseline that pulls everything else up with it. Now, let me show you what this looks like with real numbers, because I think this is where it really clicks. Let's compare two different scenarios. Person A buys a $400,000 house. Person B buys an $800,000 house. Both of them have the same income, let's say $150,000 per year, and both of them are pretty good with money overall. Person A has a mortgage payment of about $2,500 per month. Person B has a mortgage payment of about $5,000 per month. So far, Person B is spending an extra $2,500 per month. That's $30,000 per year. Over 10 years, that's $300,000 that person A has available to invest that person B doesn't. But wait, it gets more interesting. Person A's property taxes are about $400 per month. Person B's are about $800. Person A's insurance is $150 per month. Person B's is $300. Person A spends about $200 per month on utilities. Person B spends about $350. Person A does their own lawn care, maybe $50 per month for supplies. Person B pays a service, $300 per month. We're now up to about $3,600 per month difference, or $43,200 per year. But here's where the lifestyle multiplication really kicks in. Person A furnished their house over time from a mix of places, spent about $30,000 total. Person B felt like they needed nicer furniture for the bigger house, spent $80,000. Person A drives a decent used car, $25,000. Person B feels like they need a car that matches the neighborhood, bought something for $60,000. Person A's kids go to good public schools. Person B felt pressure to send their kids to private school because that's what the neighbors do, $20,000 per year. When you add all of this up, Person B is spending about $100,000 more per year than Person A, even though they have the same income. Over 10 years, that's $1 million. And here's a really important part. Person A is investing that difference. At a modest 8% annual return, that $1 million becomes about $1.5 million after 10 years. Person B, meanwhile, has a house that maybe appreciated, maybe didn't, but definitely tied up a huge amount of their wealth in an asset they can't easily access. Now, am I saying everyone should buy the cheapest house possible? No, absolutely not. What I'm saying is that there's a sweet spot, and that sweet spot is usually a lot lower than what most people think. The question you need to ask isn't what's the most expensive house I can afford. The question is what's the least expensive house that genuinely makes me happy and meets my actual needs. And here's something really interesting. When researchers have studied this, they found that life satisfaction from your house peaks at a pretty moderate price point. Going from a $200,000 house to a $400,000 house makes a real difference in happiness. Going from $400,000 to $800,000, much smaller difference. Going from $800,000 to $1.6 million, almost no difference at all. But the wealth building cost keeps going up exponentially. So what do wealthy people actually do? Well, they think about houses completely differently than most people. They see a house as a place to live, not as a symbol of success or achievement. They're asking different questions. Instead of, will this impress people? And here's something really interesting. A lot of wealthy people actually live in what I call stealth wealth houses. These are houses that are really nice, well-maintained, in good neighborhoods. But they're not flashy. They're not the biggest house on the street. They're not designed to impress anyone. They're designed to be comfortable and functional while minimizing that lifestyle multiplication effect we talked about. I know a family worth about $12 million. They live in a house worth $650,000. It's a great house. 4 bedrooms, nice yard, good schools nearby. But here's what's interesting. They could easily afford a $3 or $4 million house. They just chose not to because they ran the math and realized that the extra 2.5 or 3.5 million tied up in a house was money that couldn't compound for them in investments. And this is where it gets really interesting. They took that 2.5 million they didn't spend on a bigger house and invested it. At 8% returns, that 2.5 million grows to about 5.4 million over 10 years. So by not buying the expensive house, they essentially gained an extra 2.9 million in wealth. That's the real cost of the expensive house. Not just what you pay for it, but what that money could have become if you'd invested it instead. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, but a house is an investment too, right? It appreciates in value. And yes, houses can appreciate, but here's the reality. After you account for maintenance, repairs, property taxes, insurance, and all the other costs, the average house appreciates at about 3 to 4% per year. Meanwhile, a diversified investment portfolio historically returns about 8 to 10% per year. So you're not just tying up your money, you're tying it up in something that grows slower than your other options. Let me give you another real example that I think makes this really clear. I know two guys who graduated from the same business school program, started their careers around the same time. Both got into tech sales. By age 35, they were both making about $200,000 per year. Pretty similar trajectories, but one of them bought a $1.2 million house. The other bought a $500,000 house and invested the difference. Fast forward to age 45. The guy with the expensive house has a net worth of about $800,000, most of it tied up in home equity. The guy with the modest house has a net worth of about $2.3 million, with more than half of it in liquid investments. Same income, same careers, completely different outcomes. And it all came down to that one decision about how much house to buy. So, what's the practical takeaway here? How do you actually apply this? Well, here's a framework that I think works really well. When you're thinking about buying a house, use what I call the 2x rule. Take the house you're considering and imagine one that costs half as much. Be honest with yourself. How much would your actual day-to-day happiness decrease if you bought the less expensive house? In most cases, the answer is not very much. Now, imagine taking all the money you'd save, both the lower mortgage and all those lifestyle costs that would be lower, and investing it instead. How much would that improve your future financial security? Usually, the answer is a lot. That's a trade-off. A small decrease in daily housing satisfaction for a large increase in long-term financial freedom. For most people, building wealth, that's a trade worth making. Here's another thing wealthy people do with houses that most people don't consider. They think about houses in terms of percentage of net worth, not percentage of income. Most financial advice tells you to keep your house at 2 to 3 times your annual income. But wealthy people think about it differently. They usually try to keep their primary residence at 20 to 30% of their net worth maximum. So if someone has a net worth of $2 million, they're aiming for a house worth $400,000 to $600,000, even if their income could support something much more expensive. This way, the majority of their wealth stays invested and working for them rather than being tied up in their house. And as their net worth grows, they might upgrade their house, but they keep it proportional. I also want to address something that comes up a lot in these discussions. People say, but I want to enjoy my money now, not just when I'm old. And I totally get that. But here's the thing. Having more money invested doesn't mean you can't enjoy life. It actually means you have more freedom to enjoy life in ways that matter to you. Maybe you love travel. Great. Take amazing vacations. Maybe you love great food. Awesome. Eat at incredible restaurants. Maybe you love cars. Fine. Buy a car you love within reason. The point is that you get to consciously choose what brings you joy rather than having a huge percentage of your money automatically locked into a house that might not even be making you that much happier. That's what I mean by conscious spending. You're making active choices about where your money goes based on what actually matters to you, not just following the default path of buying the biggest house you can afford. Now, let's talk about what actually matters in a house because I think this is where people get confused. When researchers study what makes people happy about their homes, a few things come up consistently. Location matters a lot. Being close to work, friends, and activities you enjoy. Space matters, but only to a point. Having enough room for your family and your lifestyle is important. Beyond that, extra space doesn't do much. Quality matters more than luxury. A well-maintained, solid house that's not fancy will usually make you happier than a fancy house that has constant problems. And neighborhood matters. Being somewhere safe where you like your neighbors and feel connected. But here's what's interesting. None of these things necessarily require spending more money. You can have a great location, adequate space, good quality, and a nice neighborhood without buying an expensive house. The expensive houses add things like impressive architecture, high-end finishes, luxury amenities, and sure, those things are nice. But they don't contribute nearly as much to daily happiness as you'd think. You get used to them really quickly. That's called hedonic adaptation. The granite countertops that seemed amazing when you bought the house, 6 months later, they're just countertops. the fancy master bathroom. After a few months, it's just where you brush your teeth. So here's my recommendation. When you're thinking about buying a house, write down what would actually make you happy on a daily basis. Maybe it's a yard for your kids. Maybe it's a home office. Maybe it's being in a specific school district. Maybe it's having a garage for your hobbies. Whatever it is, be specific. Then find the least expensive house that gives you those things. Don't pay extra for impressive features that aren't on your list just because they're there. And here's another strategy that a lot of wealthy people use. They buy houses with room to add value. Maybe it needs updating. Maybe the landscaping needs work. Maybe it needs better paint and fixtures. They buy it below market because it needs work, then they add value over time. This way, they're forced to keep the purchase price reasonable and they end up with a house they really like without overpaying. I know a couple who did this perfectly. They bought a house for $380,000 that needed cosmetic work. Over 3 years, they spent about $60,000 upgrading it, doing a lot of the work themselves when they could. Now it's worth about $550,000, so they'll have $110,000 in equity gain. But here's what's even better. Because they bought a cheaper house to start, their mortgage payment was low enough that they can invest an extra $2,000 per month over those same 3 years with market returns. That became about $85,000. So they created wealth in two ways. The house appreciated because they bought smart and added value. And they had money left over to invest because they didn't max out their budget. That's a strategy. Buy less house than you can afford, add value over time if you want, and invest the difference. It's not exciting, it's not impressive, but it works incredibly well for building actual wealth. Let me give you one more example that I think really brings this home. I know someone who's worth about $40 million, self-made, built and sold a business. You know what kind of house he lives in? It's worth about $1.8 million. Very nice house, don't get me wrong, but he could easily afford a $10 or $15 million house. Why doesn't he? That's the mindset shift. It's not about denying yourself. It's about being honest about what actually adds value to your life versus what just looks impressive but doesn't make you happier. And once you make that shift, everything else becomes a lot clearer.